Casey.
Hello, my name is Casey.
Yeah.
I'll do my best to compose my thoughts every time I watch any rendition of that movie. It fills me with a range of different feelings and emotions. I range from really angry and really sad and really hopeless to also very inspired and very hopeful. So this is probably I've seen this film a dozen times, and it's probably the 7th or 8th different version of this film that I've seen. So I really want, even though he's not here, I just am so appreciative of Danny and all of the people that have worked on this important documentary over time. Thank you guys all for staying and coming in the first place to watch this film. Some just key highlights before we get into Q&A. There were moments in this film where you see multiple different people talk about, oh, this was like my induction into the movement, or this is where I got involved, or this is where I made my first political action. And I think young and old, all of us right now struggle with, like, where is that moment, where is that time when we can be involved and do that thing? And because we are all such planners, we're all like, okay, I would really like to know when that moment is going to come. And it's just not really the way that it works. But what is important is being able to identify that moment when it happens and being willing to engage with that moment when it happens. And it's coming for all of us. I mean, it could not be any more apparent at this day and age how behind the 8 ball that we are. I mean, as inspired as I am by this film, it is so apparent that the wave of political action, peaceful political action, all of those things swelled up and came to this moment, and all of the peaceful protesters and peaceful activists came front and center with violence and violent repercussions to nonviolent action, and then the wave receded. And we are right now in that moment where I am so inspired by all of the people from all the different movements, Kent State, Jackson State, and everywhere else that it happened. But simply that this fight is not only not over, but it's happening right now in the shadows, and it is more important than ever for us to take advantage of every single moment that we see a moment to fight injustice and simply be heard, even if fighting injustice looks like not fighting at all, but simply being present. Let's get on with it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I have to agree in part with what was just said at the last moment, is that it is a much more complex game that is afoot right now with infiltration on both sides. It becomes legitimate for the state to take action against protesters when protesters cross that line of nonviolent to violent. And I mean, if part of what we're here to discuss is current events, many people that are Eugene community and national community that spent time at Standing Rock before Standing Rock was disassembled were called back here with all kinds of stories and direct quotes of people that were infiltrating on the Standing Rock side, pretending to be supporters and activists, that then when they came against the police lines, they would instigate violent action against the police, giving the police a reason, and a legitimate reason, and a legal reason to directly enact violence upon the protesters. So I think we're at a time when, at any point in time, when there is a protest, violent or nonviolent, that it is an action of the opposition to find a way to get people to engage, and whether that's through infiltration or simply feeding the fire to help it erupt a little bit. The actions that happened last week in Portland, I think that's really interesting, because I actually didn't even hear about it for a couple of days, and I'm sure that some of you are aware of that happening, and other people of you are sitting there right here right now being like, well, what is he talking about? What we're talking about is 100 miles from here, last week, a peaceful protest that was going down, that at some level there was anarchist instigation that happened against the police, and whether that was legitimate or illegitimate, broke out in tear gas, broke out in, I mean, like, and this is on the doorstep, and it's not making our news or our front headlines or our Facebook streaming, it is not on the forefront when action for the people or action for social justice is happening. It is pushed aside for anything else that draws your attention and draws the headline. We are unfortunately in the day and age where if you want to know what's going on, you have got to seek it out, and you have to seek it out from sources that are not mainstream sources.
Seems to suggest that when the shooting stopped, things got really quiet and the guard kind of retreated. The little bit of reading that I've done, my understanding is that there was 5, 10, 15 minutes where there was a tremendous amount of rage on the part of the students, and that further confrontation was very much hanging in the balance for some amount of time. There was a professor whose name escapes me. There's an iconic photo of him. He's a flat-top guy who pleaded and begged with the students to disperse, that more killings were going to happen. I'm just curious your take on that.
I would say, as a disclaimer, clearly so many of you were alive and present and witnessing Kent State at a time in your life, and I was not doing that, so I will not speak from being in a place of I know exactly what happened. What I will say is, through all of the stories that I, very fortunately enough, grew up with Candy and Howie and my mom and Danny, that's very much a reality of what was going on there then, right then, that the shootings happened and everybody was still there. You know, these, at Kent, they talked for a minute about Blanket Hill. Blanket Hill is on campus when you come. I was fortunate enough to go with them at the 40th anniversary. At the very end there, where Chick Canfora is giving the speech talking about you are the children of the Woodstock generation, and don't think for a minute that corporate America did not see you coming. This is 40 years after the shooting, when other than about 2 people underground, everybody else that had been underground is finally either out of being underground or out of the correctional facilities, and were able to come back together on campus. So from all of them, what I would tell you is that on the campus there, when you come over Blanket Hill into this kind of open flat area, and you saw the bell there a couple of times, there was the bell that the student was ringing. It's where the student center happened. That's right where the ROTC building was that got burned down, and then surrounded by that is you're surrounded by buildings. You're really like concealed there. And so when the students got out over the Blanket Hill and the National Guard were on Blanket Hill, there wasn't really anywhere for these students to disperse to. So after these shootings happened, you had lots of students that were engaged with injured students. And other than that, you know, think about each interaction where there's 13 people on the ground. You know, there's no more than 6 or 7 people trying to engage with the helping of that person. We're then talking about another 3,000 to 5,000 students that are still in the proximity of that area, where there's hundreds of National Guard still there that are poised at any moment. So my take on that is that there was a real internal battle to not take violent action, because taking further violent action at that moment in time would have done nothing more than incite more violent action against the students. And as we can see through the course of this film and through the course of the last 65 years, that justice has never been done at that moment. So to engage in further instigation of that militant force would not have provided the outcome of justice, but rather more injured students. And I think, though I wasn't there, any professors or any student leaders or simply student voices of reason that happened to be there were trying to let people know that their energies and their angst was well-founded but needed to be channeled elsewhere.
Very good. Next question.
I can't believe it's been 47 years since 1970, and all the wars that we've been through and things that happened in our lifetime. So what I want to ask is, what does it look like when this changes? I think we all agree that having a violent revolution won't work, because you can't impose a change on a society without bringing out a backlash and more violence. And so if there can't be a violent spasm and there isn't a violent path, we've worked nonviolently all these years through persuasion and all this. So my question is, what does it look like? When is it going to change? How does it ever change? Or do we have to go for another 100 years like this with a war after war after war?
I'm going to defer to my elders on expertise on that, but I just wanted to jump back in because
Good
before
job.
she leaves, and I don't know if she's even still here, we collectively wanted to give an acknowledgement of a woman in the audience named Sharon, who was actually present at Jackson State during the time of the Jackson State shootings. And so one tidbit would simply be that I think Danny, Dr. Miller, who has been making this film for quite a long time, has been struggling with, as you see in the very end of the film, you know, the shootings at Kent State are not more important than the shootings that happened at Jackson State or any of these other places. Simply that those students were white is what brings them to the forefront. And so this film that focuses directly on Kent State has had a hard time being produced and released, because once you get into the nitty-gritty of everything that was going on, it's so clearly evident that there are so many important factors and locations and groups of people that deserve to be addressed, because this part of American history is so widely swept over and we have no education about it, that I think that, anyway, even though it's briefly swept over, I think that's part of the dilemma of the filmmaker, is that to just cover this area and only cover what happened at Kent State almost perpetuates what we're talking about here, is that we only take recognition of what's going on in the world when it affects somebody that looks like us, and that's a problem.
This is Sharon.
Hi, Sharon.
Just one quick comment. I marched in the streets with the students last week. To me, that is our future. So we have to get that, the student generation and ours, all the generations have got to come together if we're going to succeed in saving, saving this planet.
Go through the ballot box.
Did you have anything, Steve? Here. So here's Sharon.
Okay, back in 1970, I was attending Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi. It was a liberal Methodist school. Could you hear me?
Yeah. That's better.
Okay, the day after the shooting, a bunch of us at Millsaps, we all decided to march around the governor's mansion, and students from Jackson State joined us, and it was just an amazing experience. And this is a great film, and I just appreciate this so much.
Thank you for being here. So I have a question in the back first.
Right, comments too.
Here we go.
Were there any specific National Guardsmen that were charged with murder? I mean, how did they all get off without being charged with murder?
All that I can say about that is that nobody was ever charged, and that Governor Rhodes ultimately should be the person that, if nobody can be specifically put together for having fired, Governor Rhodes would be that person. And in line with the end of the film, when they talk about how the students were very pleased when Bill Kunstler helped get the trial thrown out of court, that they burned the documentation as to what actually happened on May the 4th. And in that moment, in burning the documentation, eliminated all possibility of the truth ever coming to the forefront.
That music is our cue. I'm Wayne Martin, and I'm part of the Encircle Films Center. And I just wanted to let you know that in June, a few of us are planning an action where we're going to have a dog parade. And I'd like you to stay tuned. I'd like you to check out the weekly. We are working with homeless folks who would like to speak out and let council and let business people know that they need their animals. So support us, would you, when you read more about this soon.
I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. This